Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Horner, Director of Education at Emory's Michael C. Carlos Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Before we begin, I would like to express my warmest thanks to Lynn Kirkland, who honored the memory of her mother by endowing the Grace Welch Blanton Lecture Fund at the Carlos, which has made tonight's program possible. I would also like to thank the Decatur Book Festival and the Georgia Humanities Council for their support of educational programming at the Carlos, as well as all of the members of the Carlos Museum, whose support makes events like this possible on an ongoing basis. And of course, Dr. Megan O'Neill, Assistant Professor of Art History and Faculty Curator of the Art of the Americas, whose beautiful new gallery installation of Native North American art at the Carlos occasioned this program. In just a moment, I will turn our virtual podium over to Professor Craig Womack of Emory's Department of English, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Womack, who is Creek Cherokee by ancestry, is a seminal figure in Native American literary studies, author of the influential Red on Red, Native American Literary Separatism, and the powerful and groundbreaking novel, Drowning in Fire. On Monday, October 12th, we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. In honor of the occasion, Dr. Womack has organized and will chair a panel discussion titled McGirt versus Oklahoma, Understanding the Implications of the Recent Supreme Court Decision Across Native America. He will be joined by Sarah Deer, Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Kansas, Barbara Creel from the University of New Mexico School of Law, and Justice Andrew Adams III of the Muskogee Creek Nation Supreme Court. The program is made possible through the generous financial support of Emory's Hightower Lecture Fund and is co-sponsored by the Native American Indigenous Students Initiative, the Carlos, the Emory School of Law, Emory School of Law, Health Law and Policy and Ethics Project. The program will begin at 4 p.m. and you can register for it online at carlos.emory.edu. In addition, on November the 8th at 2 p.m., the Carlos will present a live reading of the play Sovereignty by Native American playwright and lawyer Mary Catherine Nagel. The reading will be directed by Molly Smith, who directed it on the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C., and will feature the Native American cast from that production. The program will be a fundraiser for Native American student initiatives at the Carlos Museum, and registration information will be available on the Carlos Museum next week. Two quick housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your questions. At the end of the program, I will convey them to our guests live and they will answer them live. We will not be using the chat function. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Dr. Saunt's book, Unworthy Republic, please consider purchasing it from the Carlos Museum Bookshop. I will put the manager's email address in the Q&A, and your purchase will support not only the Carlos Museum, but its small but mighty bookstore. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Craig Womack. Thank you so much for joining us and for introducing your friend and colleague.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Claudio Saunt is a professor of history at the University of Georgia. He's the author of 4 books, and I'm going to talk about the 2 that I know the best for the obvious reasons. And I'll start with the one whose cover you see in front of us, the most recent and the subject of tonight's discussion, Unworthy Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans in the Road to Indian Territory. As many of you probably know, there have been a good number of books written about Indian removal, and this book is about the Indian removals throughout the American Southeast during the 1830s. But this particular work stands out for a number of reasons, and one of those is that it examines the contemporary resonance of these policies and what's going on in the United States today, and suggests this kind of lingering and malingering effect that the Indian removals of the 1830s had on US history and even on world history. And if you want to see how this played out even beyond the United States, then you need to look at the book for sure. And to this end, Claudio purposefully deploys terms like deportation to describe Indian removal. You know, it's been called Indian removal, and people talk about expulsions of Southeast people, but he's chosen these terms that create a dialogue, really, between the past and the present. And so I appreciate this aspect of the text, the way in which it feels so contemporary when you're reading it. And as a person who's been involved teaching language arts for, I guess it's starting to approach 3 decades, another thing I like about this book a great deal is it is a kind of rhetorical analysis of claims that people were making about removal. Claims people were making in favor of removal, claims people were making against removal, claims tribal people were making about their rights to remain in their homelands. And it kind of raises the E word, a word that in my mind has become kind of anathema in humanities. It dares to broach the subject of ethics, which is another thing I value a great deal about this text. And it deals with the ethical dilemmas that result from imagining certain populations as being displaceable. The next, well, and I'll say on a personal note that I also appreciate the book because as a member of the particular community I'm from, when I think of Indian removal, I usually don't think of Indian removal, I think of Creek removal, which is the one I've studied the most, but it's also the one you hear stories about. I mean, people back home still tell stories about their relatives who were removed. But when you read a book like this and you just see how this removal was spread across a region, embedded in state politics, embedded in national politics, part of a discussion that was really infiltrating a lot of different areas of society, it really gives you a different sense of, instead of that parochial sense I usually have of thinking of just creek removal. And it's a messier sense, to be sure. It's a complex sense, but you get a lot of ideas about kind of the big picture. And there's lots of things in this book that really are insightful about the big picture for me. So I'll say that. Then I want to move on to a book that I've taught, which is called Black, White, and Indian: Race and the Unmaking of an American Family, which focuses on a single prominent Muskogee Creek family, the Grayson family, and its complex relationship with African Americans as both slaves and family members. And when I use the word complex, one of the things that is so intriguing about this book is that Claudio sort of traces this way in which the Grayson family's relationship with its African American relatives changed after removal, how the family dynamic seems to have shifted. And again, I'll leave it at that, and you can read the book if you want to find out more about this. But he also focuses on a single Grayson family member, G.W. Grayson, and a work that he wrote, an autobiographical work that wasn't published in his lifetime. But it became titled The Creek Warrior for the Confederacy, the autobiography of G.W. Grayson. It was published in 1988. And among other things, Claudio details in this work the way an Oklahoma historian, E. Everett Dale, removed parts of the autobiography that had to do with Grayson's African American family members, relatives, supposedly out of some sense to protect the family. And this delves into, getting back to ethics of ethnography, obviously, the ethics of scholarship, issues about, what about an author who puts something in his text and then you later decide to just take it out? What does all that mean? It deals with these ongoing issues of racism within and outside the Creek Nation. And it is a very sophisticated exploration of the ramifications of the Creek Nation's history with African Americans. And one of its unique features is that it includes contemporary interviews with Creek citizens who have African American ancestry, with freedmen who have Creek and African American ancestries, but who've been disenfranchised by the tribe, and by people involved in these disenfranchisement decisions in the 1980s. And it's probably, this book, Black, White, and Indian, I think is perhaps one of the most thorough and interesting books in Native studies. And last but not least, Claudio is a jazz trumpeter and pianist, and we've never played together yet, but coming this April, I'm getting out of this university racket, so I have lots more time on my hands, so who knows, that still could be a possibility. So without further ado, we welcome Claudio, and we thank Elizabeth for putting this meeting together. And she has done a truckload of work helping me put together just this thing that we're doing on Monday about the Supreme Court decision. So I just thank her for that, because she did a bunch of stuff that I have no idea how to do. So I look forward to hearing Claudio.
Thank you, Craig. That was a really wonderful and thoughtful introduction. And I didn't know that you're going to have more time on your hands soon. So yeah, let's set up a jam session. That would be fun. And thanks to all of you in the audience for tuning in. It's somewhat less than ideal circumstances for a talk, but we're going to make do. I normally like to pace back and forth and gesticulate, and now I feel somewhat like a newscaster staring at my screen. We're here, at least virtually, in the Carlos Museum at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And so tonight I want to talk about Georgia's role in the deportation of Native Americans in the 1830s. This is the period that we commonly call Indian removal. I'm not going to use that term this evening, since that is the term that was embraced by proponents of the policy. One opponent in Congress in the 1830s said that removal is a soft word and words are delusive. And in other words, there's a lot of violence and pain that hides behind this term, Indian removal. Native Americans often called it, when they were speaking English at least, they often called it an expulsion. And a few political commentators observing from abroad called it a deportation. At least one high-ranking Army officer said that the policy as it unfolded in Florida was one of extermination. So I will use those terms this evening instead of Indian removal. Let me start off just by giving you a brief overview of the situation in the 1820s. US politicians had been talking about expelling Native Americans since the beginning of the 19th century. And Thomas Jefferson famously suggested after the Louisiana Purchase that Indians perhaps could be moved onto this land. Those who lived east of the Mississippi could be shipped west. That was his hope, at least. But until 1830, there was no formal, official, state-sponsored, systematic operation to eliminate Native Americans east of the Mississippi River. You can get a sense of the situation in the 1830s from these maps. There were about between 80,000 and 100,000 indigenous people living in the United States, so east of the Mississippi River at this time, and you can see their locations here. There were about 60,000 folks, indigenous Americans, living in the South. You can see the Chickasaw and Choctaw homelands in present-day Mississippi. They owned about half of what would become the present-day state of Mississippi. You can see the creeks. Their homeland was much reduced by 1830, but you can see they still held a significant part of what became Alabama. And then you can see the Cherokees in North Georgia and Tennessee and Western North Carolina, and then the Seminoles in Florida. And then there are about 20,000 other indigenous Americans living up in the Old Northwest, so in the Great Lakes region. You can see in the far west of New York State, the Iroquois peoples, their homelands are still there. But most of these other people were removed. So in Ohio today, for example, there's not a single indigenous nation. These Americans, Native Americans, were extraordinarily diverse. They were hunters, farmers, beggars, drunks, teetotalers, Catholics, Methodists, animists. Some of them lived in traditional wattle and daub housing. Others lived in log cabins, like their white neighbors did. Some dressed in deer skins, others wore Western clothing, and some of them were better dressed than the white Americans who lived nearby. All of these nations had long-standing relations with white Americans, and they had official diplomatic relationships with the United States. So if you were to visit Washington in the 1820s, you would see colorful delegations of diplomats, Native American diplomats, walking down the street. And at any one time in DC, there could easily be 100 diplomats from Native nations. They were omnipresent in the city. And English visitors were amazed by seeing these folks. They would go to a local tavern and find them taking a coffee in the middle of the day, waiting for their appointment with the Secretary of War. In May of 1830, the US Congress passed what is officially called the Act to Provide for an Exchange of Lands with the Indians. And President Andrew Jackson hastily signed the bill into law. So this is the legislation that we commonly call the Indian Removal Act. Georgia was the chief proponent of this policy. And I think it's fair to say that without our state, the policy never would have been enacted at the national level. Wilson Lumpkin, John Berrien, John Forsyth, George Troup, Augustine Clayton, and other distinguished Georgia politicians, we all know their names because they all have counties named after them. They forced the policy onto the agenda in Washington in the 1820s, and they ensured that it became federal law in May of 1830. So before we delve into the special place in this story that is reserved for Georgia, let me give you first a few snapshots from the middle and end of the story. That is pictures of the moment of dispossession and deportation in the 1830s. So first, let's look at dispossession. Takigahelo of Tallahassee Town was invited to a white neighbor's to eat peaches in late summer 1834. There, the neighbor seized her, made her hold a pen, and told her she would be tricked out of her land unless she placed a mark on a piece of paper. After she did so, of course, signing away her land, he gave her 3 handkerchiefs and a bag of flour. One woman named Hetska was cheated by her former husband, who was a white man and the father of her child. He told a US officer that he was the head of the household, even though Creek Indians were matrilineal. And then her husband sold her land out from under her and took the profits. Land speculators threatened to kill another woman named Sully unless she signed away her farm. A witness met her on the road crying after she had placed an X on the deed. Native Americans were impersonated to obtain title, and if that didn't work, speculators resorted to violence. They chained residents in a house and beat them until they put their marks on paper. So all of these events took place in Alabama, and the victims in these instances were all Creek Indians. Mississippi, a similar sordid story unfolded. In one 3-month period in late 1833, speculators dispossessed Choctaw and Chickasaw families of 7.3 million acres of land. So that's an area the size of Massachusetts, Delaware, and Rhode Island combined. A 65-year-old woman named Amaka, she was a Choctaw woman, recently widowed, lived on her farm until a white man built a house near her, plowed right up to her front door, and then began pulling the boards off the side of her house while she was still living in it. She abandoned the property and moved to what she described as an old waste house, a sort of camp. A 75-year-old man named Okalarcha Hubby, described in the sources as an old gray-headed man having but one eye, had a similar experience. A white man put a fence around his land and ordered him out of his house. When the elderly Choctaw refused, the white man took up a whip and gave him 30 lashes. Emma Gleshahoma's wife, unnamed in the sources, sold her land and went off to New Orleans. Her husband remained behind until he was driven off with a whip. Dispossession could occur at any moment. Hayakachi, who was ill and dying, moved from his house to live under the care of nearby friends and family. Meanwhile, a white man took his land, dispossessing his soon-to-be widow. Another Choctaw man named Alahabi was visiting relatives when a white man moved into his house, leaving him deeply distressed, as the sources describe it. The family members were left with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. And so they built a house nearby, but then were turned out of that too. Alahabi seemed fit to cry, according to one witness. So there are pages and pages of these stories, of the records of these stories describing events like this. These are all housed in the National Archives today, and I spent more than one summer reading through them. Needless to say, these longtime residents were turned out of their houses and farms by people who had only just arrived in the South. And this cruel irony did not pass without comment. William Apis was a Pequot Indian and minister and one of the most incisive observers of the vicious US policy in the late 20s and early 1830s. And he imagined President Andrew Jackson talking to what Jackson called his red children. So this is this kind of imagined speech as William Apis recreates it. It is no use. You need not cry. This is Jackson speaking to his red children. You need not cry. You must go, even if the lions devour you. For we promised the land you have to somebody else long ago. And here you can see the sarcasm. We promised this land you have to somebody else long ago, perhaps 20 or 30 years. And we did it without your consent, it is true, but this has been the way our fathers first brought us up, and it is hard to depart from. Therefore, you shall have no protection from us. So now let's shift to the end of the story, a few snapshots from the moment of deportation. And I'll just give you a couple of these. One party of 500 Cherokees was deported aboard a disease-ridden steamboat called the Thomas Yateman. This was in March of 1834. So this is a few years before the majority of Cherokees were forced west. Here's a picture of the journal, which you can find today in the National Archives. So this was a journal that was kept by the person called the emigrating officer, basically a US official employed by the War Department to move these people west. And I'll just read you a couple of excerpts from this journal. April 5th, buried here, the girl child of Oskonish, a Cherokee. So they headed up down the Tennessee River, went into the Ohio River, down the Ohio into the Mississippi, and then eventually into the up the Arkansas River. So April 5th, buried here, the girl child of Oskonish, a Cherokee. April 6th, Stephen Spaniard's girl child died this morning of measles. April 7th, Bear Paw's boy child died this morning of dysentery. April 9th, Henson's child died today of the worms. April 10th, Richardson's child died this morning. And so you can see these deaths one by one, day by day, and it only got worse. In the space of 2 days, A man named Black Fox lost his wife and 3 children. Will Tucker lost 4 sons. Over one 3-day period on the Arkansas River, 23 people died. So by the time the party reached present-day Oklahoma, 1 out of every 6 people had died, including 45 children under the age of 10. This particular party of deportees suffered more than many others, but their experience is nonetheless indicative of the disregard that most white Americans held for their indigenous neighbors. As a father myself, I'm always struck by a single image of an event that occurred in the fall of 1838 on the Tennessee River, so just across the border with Georgia. In the chaos of being loaded onto a keel boat, a Cherokee man had become separated from his young son. And he asked to wait for his child, but a US soldier leveled a gun at the father and forced him aboard without his child. This casual cruelty pervaded US policy in the 1830s. So why was Georgia at the forefront of this policy? That's the question I want to address this evening. If you were to ask Georgia politicians in the 1830s, they would give you 2 main reasons for their advocacy of this policy. The first thing they said is that expulsion was the best thing for Native Americans. Indians, said Senator John Eliot of Georgia in 1825, Indians were dwindling. They were dispirited and degraded. He said this on the floor of the Senate. Eliot invoked a favorite metaphor. He said, like a promontory of sand exposed to the ceaseless encroachments of the ocean, Indians have been gradually wasting away before the current of white population. And like-minded politicians repeated this refrain endlessly in Congress and in well-placed editorials around the country. Native peoples were going to vanish, to disappear, and so to rescue them, the best thing for them would be to, so they argued, ship them west. This very cynical PR campaign reached a low point in July of 1829 when Andrew Jackson's administration funded the creation of what it called the New York Indian Board for Emigration, Preservation, and Improvement of the Aborigines of America. Despite its truly grandiose name, few people were fooled by this political operation posing as a philanthropic organization. But nonetheless, the PR campaign created cover for cynical politicians to pretend that their self-serving policies were rooted in a commendable humanitarianism. And I'll give you one example of this. Wilson Lumpkin, whom you see pictured here on your screen. Lumpkin served Georgia first in the State House, then he was the governor of the state, and then he moved on to Congress. He was first a representative in Washington, and then he became a senator. And he made it his life's mission to expel the Cherokees from their homelands. And by the way, I live about a block away from Lumpkin Street, named after Wilson Lumpkin. And the University of Georgia, where I teach, is built on his former plantation. His house still sits on campus. In 1828, Lumpkin wrote, quote, "My convictions from the beginning have induced me to look to the emigration plan as the only hopeful, safe, and permanent place of extending lasting benefits to this afflicted race." In other words, he set himself up as a philanthropist out to save Native peoples. And he said this over and over in public. Native peoples were not fooled, and there's some correspondence between Cherokees in which they say, you can't trust this man for even a second. The second reason that Georgia politicians cited for expelling people from their homes, that is, in addition to the purported humanitarian benefits, the second reason was rooted in high-minded political theory. It was a contradiction, Georgia politicians said, to have a state within a state. It was an anomaly, and they used a fancy Latin phrase for this. They said it was an imperium in imperio, that is, a state within a state. Let me change this light is flickering. I'm going to adjust it a little bit. So the second reason, a state within a state, oh, it's still going. Try that. The second of these reasons is easy to dismiss because the United States is in fact made up of many states within a larger state. And people pointed this out at the time. One Savannah resident said that these pleas of necessity, that these pleas that suggesting that somehow this was a political impossibility, he said these were nothing more than an excuse to stretch the hand of power over indigenous Americans. So the second reason clearly doesn't hold any water. The first reason, that deportation was a humanitarian operation, is also easy to dismiss. That is, if rather than taking the perpetrators at their word, we listen to the testimony of the victims. So John Ross, whom you see pictured here, the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, detailed a long list of abuses committed by Georgia militia and by federal officers. The state's politicians, he said, insisted that this bill, the removal bill to expel Native Americans, was founded in humanity. Who was right, he said, let subsequent facts decide. But he knew the facts already, and he knew that the facts were on his side. Over and over again, indigenous leaders repeated that Native Americans were not wearing away like a promontory of sand on the beach, or another favorite metaphor, a mound of snow in the sun. In fact, they said they were doing just fine where they lived. Creek leaders complained that their so-called friends, these people, white reformers who called themselves Friends of the Indians, that they had fabricated, these friends had fabricated and planted newspaper stories claiming that Indians were in rapid decline. It is due to our nation, these Creek leaders wrote, to contradict the statements calculated to mislead the minds of good men. And Elias Boudinot, the talented editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, you see pictured here, wrote in frustration, "We repeat again that the Cherokees are not on the decline in numbers and improvement." And in fact, this does appear to be the case. It's certainly true that there had been a truly significant decline in the indigenous population between 1500 and 1800. But really the best evidence suggests that by the early 19th century, Native peoples east of the Mississippi River, that their populations were stable and even in some places increasing. So one Cherokee who was confronted with a US agent who was traveling through the Cherokee Nation trying to get people to enroll for deportation, this one Cherokee summed up the way he saw this US policy. He imagined the US agent saying, "Let me give you money to allow me to kill you." So these are the professed reasons for expelling indigenous Americans. What then are the real reasons? Why did Georgia take a leading role in eliminating Native peoples from the South? And I'm guessing that many of you in the audience will point to the Georgia Gold Rush. And there is something satisfying about this story. It has a clear and simple chronology. beginning with the public announcement of the discovery of gold on August 1st, 1829. It has a simple, if not universal motive, which is gold fever. And it has a tragic conclusion, the Trail of Tears. The only problem with this is that it's wrong, because long before the discovery of gold, Georgia was pushing to eliminate indigenous Americans. And they were not just speaking about it, they were plotting and organizing. They were trying to figure out what would be the best way to get the federal government on their side. So in the winter of 1826, 1827, so again, before anyone knew anything about gold, at least any white folks knew anything about gold in the Georgia mountains, Southern congressmen met and drew up a strategy to expel Native peoples. And the strategy was simple, cynical, and as events would prove, it was highly effective. The strategy was that Southern states would extend oppressive laws over sovereign Indian nations in the South and make the lives of Native peoples so unbearable that they would depart for the West. And the brilliance of this plan, at least from the perspective of these politicians, is that Native peoples would then be departing willingly, at least nominally so. No one would be forcing them to sign treaties to leave their homelands. So the real reason that Georgia led the way is that its planter politicians were transfixed by visions of an expansive slave empire that would be presided over by none other than themselves. Georgia was then the largest state in the Union, not including what they deemed to be the worthless and swampy state of Florida to their south. Georgia was even larger than the Empire State of New York. That is, if, and this is a big if indigenous land title was disregarded. If Native peoples could be eliminated from Georgia, the state would dominate the Union. Even more ambitiously, if Native peoples could be eliminated from neighboring Alabama and Mississippi, then the slave empire would march westward, and the beneficiaries, the people who had invested the capital, would amass tremendous wealth. And why stop there? In fact, Southern planters had visions of expanding slavery to the Pacific coast and then down into Mexico. And eventually they hoped to seize Cuba as well. Their ambitions knew no bounds. But first things first, the step one was to take the lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And these were some of the most valuable agricultural lands in the entire world at the time, but they were frustratingly out of reach to planters. So here you can see this arc of very fertile soil. It cuts through the Creek Nation, through the center of Alabama, and then turns north, cuts through the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations in present-day Mississippi. This is what we call the Black Belt, named after the color of the soil. Sometimes ecologists will call it the Black Prairie. It was formed some 70 or 80 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. And it is extraordinarily fertile. And the soil there is especially high in calcium, which cotton takes up in large quantities. So Georgia did not desire to expel Native peoples to save them. It did not want to expel them because of high-minded political theory. It did so, rather, to expand slavery across the South. And you can get a sense of the excitement that was surrounding, the excitement that was building up in the planter community when they were gaining access to these lands. One of the largest speculators based in Columbus, Georgia, one of my favorite characters, really, in the sense that he's just as villainous a character as you could imagine, even in fiction. His name was Eli Shorter, and he purchased hundreds of square miles of creek land through by using the most nefarious means you can imagine. And then he tried to flip that land for a profit. So this is an ad that he put in the Columbus Inquirer in April of 1835. As you can see, it says, important to cotton planters. It details 18 of 385 tracts amounting to over 192 square miles of creek lands. So the speculation was rampant in indigenous lands. It's worth pausing here for a second just to consider the significance of this transformation in the South. The US government deported approximately 60,000 people from the region. In Georgia, Alabama, and Florida alone, the United States seized, or rather Mississippi alone, the United States seized over 40,000 square miles of land. That's an area the size of Virginia. And the intruders frequently commented on the age of the orchards that they discovered. There were peach trees in Mississippi these were peach trees that Choctaws and Chickasaws had planted decades before. There were peach trees measuring an amazing 18 inches across at the trunk. And these were cut down and replaced with cotton. Planters shipped thousands of enslaved laborers into the region. And you can get a sense of the transformation in this map. Each dot here represents 100 enslaved people in 1850. So this is only, when you look at the indigenous nations, this is only some 10 to 15 years after these folks had been deported. And you can see this swath of these slave plantations and enslaved peoples who now were working in what once had been indigenous land in Alabama, and then in Choctaw and the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. Over the course of the 1830s, the enslaved population in Alabama more than doubled. In a single decade, it more than doubled to 253,000. By the end of the decade, nearly 1 out of every 4 slaves in Alabama worked on land that only a few years earlier had belonged to Creek peoples. In Mississippi, a similar transformation took place. Planters shipped 100,000 enslaved people into the state in the 6 years after the passage of the Expulsion Act. So by 1836, there were approximately 144,000 white Americans in Mississippi, and there were over 164,000, so the majority of the population, 164,000 African Americans, imprisoned for life for no other reason than the accident of their birth. And they toiled in cotton fields in the region's rapidly expanding plantations. The lands that the federal government expropriated in the decade of deportation furnished nearly 160 million pounds of ginned cotton in 1850. So that is equal to 16% of the entire crop in the United States. And again, you can see that pictured here. Each dot here equals 100,000 pounds of ginned cotton in 1850, and you can see just how quickly this transformation took place in the South. In fact, native lands produced 40% of the total value of the agricultural output in Mississippi and Alabama. So in short, the deportation of indigenous Americans turned the South into a land of sprawling plantations worked by unfree laborers who, with their children and their children's children, were enslaved in perpetuity. So this leads to one last question, which may have occurred to you. If planters wanted to expand slavery to grow more cotton, they had largely accomplished their goal by 1836. And that year, US troops waged a short and vicious war against the Creeks. US troops captured and imprisoned 1,600 men. They put them in chains and they marched them to Montgomery, Alabama, where they were herded at gunpoint onto steamboats that were headed for the west. The survivors of this war who were able to escape US troops fled across South Georgia. They were headed for Seminole country in Florida. But in Georgia, they were met by state militia. In one instance, militia tracked down and attacked 300 refugees who were fleeing south. And after the Creeks escaped a hard-fought battle, the militia discovered 2 crying infants who had been hidden away in a canebrake, and they found a 6-year-old girl as well. Their fates are unknown. We learn only from the source that the children were reportedly, as the source says, taken away by gentlemen who seemed pleased to have them. So the Creeks were largely, not entirely, but largely gone by 1836. At the same time, Choctaw and Chickasaw families had either left Mississippi or were on their way out. So why then insist that the Cherokees leave? Their lands, and you can see this clearly on the map, their lands were hardly suitable for growing cotton. As you can see, there's virtually no or relatively very little cotton production in Cherokee country. And as for gold, the gold rush had largely played itself out, at least in the case of surface or placer mining. That gold that was easy and inexpensive to mine was gone by the mid-1830s, and it was attracting little interest and little investment. You can see on this map here that the vast majority of the Cherokee Nation did not bear gold. And you can also see that the vast majority of gold-bearing areas did not lie in the Cherokee Nation. Nonetheless, Georgia politicians insisted, and they threatened. In May of 1838, George Washington Bonaparte Towns of Georgia went to the floor of the House. John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, amazingly was listening from the gallery when Georgia's representative demanded the rights of planters. Georgia was a proud slaveholding state, he said, and it would jealously guard her honor and her liberty. The Cherokees had to leave immediately, he said. A few days later, US troops swept into the Cherokee Nation and rounded up the residents at gunpoint. So by June of 1838, only a few weeks after the launch of this operation, the commander of the Georgia militia proudly reported that the operation was complete. Scouts, he said, had recently searched North Georgia in every direction without seeing any Indians or late Indian signs, as they said. But to be certain, mounted volunteers swept through the country once more. The land was deserted. General Winfield Scott, who oversaw the operation, said Georgia has been entirely cleared of red population. Throughout the region, houses stood empty of residents. The objects of everyday life rested in place. The sources describe a fiddle, chairs, a bed, a spinning wheel. These were all Cherokee possessions, a cooking pot, a bag of dried fruit, playing horn. Troops stole much of this property, and what remained was later auctioned off by the federal government. So a man named John Dawson bought 4 axes that had once belonged to a Cherokee named Taliska. Someone named Mr. Sloan purchased Chewy's fiddle. Mr. McSpadden bought Crabgrass's canoe. Someone named John Oxford purchased Amatiska's pot. And a Miss Goddard bought Soapy's bed. US citizens moved into Cherokee houses, slept in their beds, ate out of their pots. The occupiers used sheep shears, hoes, fishing spears, augers, and baskets, fiddles that still bore the handprints of the original owners. The arrogation of Cherokee things, as bizarre as it was, went without comment in the Southern press. So why did Georgia politicians continue to insist on eliminating the Cherokees? They had gotten what they wanted. The answer, I think, has to do with one additional connection between slavery and the expulsion of indigenous Americans. The presence of the Cherokees in Georgia threatened white supremacy. And it did this concretely in two ways. First, it invited the federal government into the region, since the federal government had and continues to have treaty obligations to the Cherokees, and since the US Constitution gives the federal government the power to regulate commerce, broadly defined, with Indian tribes. In other words, the presence of the Cherokees brought the federal government down into the South. Second, the Cherokees were a colored population, and I'm using the language here of an 1827 editorial that appeared in a Milledgeville newspaper. If the federal government had the power to determine the condition of one class of people in Georgia, that is, if the federal government recognized the sovereign rights of the Cherokees, then it could also determine the condition of other classes of people. Or as one editorialist put it, the extension of rights to Indians within a state differs from the like extension of rights to free Negroes and slaves within the same state only in the shade of color between the two races. Simply put, this was a threat to the supremacy of white planters who ruled almost without check over their slaves and over the small free Black population. As one editorialist wrote in 1825, we, the people of Georgia, meant we, the white people of Georgia. African Americans were property, not citizens, and indigenous Americans had no place in a world built on white supremacy and Black slavery. And I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Claudio, for that sobering talk. If you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we will share them live. Craig, I don't know if you had a question to start.
I don't at this point.
I was wondering, Claudio, if you could talk a little bit about the financing of all of this and the connection with the northeastern banks that made some of this possible.
Right. So a lot of this story that I recounted tonight actually takes place in Alabama and Mississippi, but the capital came from Georgia planners, and then also, as you mentioned, from northern financiers and Wall Street. And this was something I found that really surprised me. No one had really written about this. So the wealthiest bankers in Wall Street recognized quite early on that there was a fortune to be made by dispossessing Native peoples of their lands. And so they created joint stock companies and funneled literally millions of dollars, even in 1830s dollars, down into Alabama and Mississippi. In fact, some of the capital even came from abroad. So there were London financiers who were also pouring money into this operation. And perhaps, although I didn't really follow this, it seems that some of the money may have come from continental Europe as well. So that's really a kind of international operation when you look at it from that perspective.
So we do have some questions now. One person asks, in those cases where Christian Cherokees were being expelled and dispossessed, was there any organized pro-Cherokee advocacy from their white co-religionists?
In fact, Indian removal is the single most controversial issue to face the Republic up to 1830. And it generates an extraordinary, in fact, the first mass petition campaign to Congress. So if you look at the records in the National Archives belonging to Congress today, you can read through these petitions. There are hundreds of them signed by thousands of people. There's not a single petition, not a single anti-removal petition that comes from anywhere in the South. All of these are coming from the North, and they are coming, as the question suggests, they're coming from church-based groups. Now, one thing I think it's important to underscore is that Cherokee, or rather Native Indian politicians and public intellectuals had cultivated this opposition in the 1820s, and in fact, they went on speaking tours throughout the Northeast, making the case that this law was contrary to the values of the American Revolution.
Another questioner asks if you can describe the transition to land lotteries in North Georgia.
So the land lotteries, this is an interesting question because it fits in with the story, I think, which is commonly told and taught in Georgia schools, at least as I can glean from the students I have at the University of Georgia. And that story says that the gold rush led to this influx of squatters. There's certainly some truth to that. And that the lotteries, and there were multiple lotteries, and one was specific to the gold lands, that these lotteries distributed the land to the citizens of Georgia, basically inviting them into the Cherokee Nation. And again, there's some truth to that as well. But what's fascinating is that a lot of the folks who won these lotteries basically won a ticket that gave them a claim to some parcel of land in the Cherokee Nation. They never claimed the land. And that's because if they didn't win a portion of the land that had valuable gold deposits, they were not interested in it. So the state assembly actually had to pass multiple laws extending the period in which people had to claim that land. And they do this through into the 1850s. They're passing laws saying, well, you can have another year to claim your land in the Cherokee Nation. Finally, in the early 1850s, they say the remaining land that hasn't been claimed will revert to the state. But all of this is to suggest that this deportation, which I think we often think of as being inevitable, was not at all. And indigenous politicians recognized this fact, and John Ross, through the spring of 1838, was still negotiating to permit the Cherokees to remain in their homelands.
Another question has to do with the one drop of blood aspect. The question says, you mentioned colored as a part of the issue. Did the one drop of blood play a role?
Well, not that exact phrase, except that when you look at laws in Georgia in the teens and 20s, there's a lot of confusion about who is who. So the laws will specify colored people and then say, and then mention Indians separately. So sometimes they'll say that, sometimes they'll say all colored people, and they seemingly mean to include indigenous Americans as well. Sometimes they will refer to half-breeds. So there's a lot of confusion about who falls into what category. And white politicians are particularly concerned and troubled by the folks who are kind of on opposite sides of the spectrum. There are the folks who have African ancestry who are Cherokee or Creek. What are they supposed to be slaves? Where do they fit within these laws? Federal officers who are sent down to the Creek Nation to take a census are entirely puzzled by this. They find nominally enslaved people who are of African ancestry, who are happily married to Creek people. They find, in one instance, I remember a couple of Creek orphans who were being raised by an African-American woman in the Creek Nation. So they don't fall into these really simplistic and crude racial categories that Georgia politicians kind of would like to fit everybody into.
Let's see, there are questions about, forgive me, I'm going a little bit backwards. Craig had brought up in the introduction the connections between this history and today, and wondering if you could speak about that.
Well, I mean, so this is a huge question, and I mean, I think it's obvious. One of the things I tried to underscore in the book was that this was really a political decision that was made, again, to get away from the sense of inevitability. It was a political decision made by voters. At the time, voters were limited to white men. But they were confronted with this situation and clearly made the wrong call. The actual law passed by a mere 5 votes in Congress out of 199 cast. So it just barely made it through. There were too many cowardly politicians at the time and too many voters who either didn't care or were personally invested in separating Indigenous Americans from their lands. So, the flip side of that, as I mentioned, is that there is this petition campaign, and in the petitions that are sent into Congress, and in fact are overwhelming Congress, they're frustrated, they don't know what to do with them. The petitions really call on and insist that the United States live up to the values as it expressed in the era of the American Revolution. So you have to remember the Republic at this time was only some 40 years old. And there was this real question of was it going to be different from what folks called deemed to be these corrupt and despotic nations in Europe? Was the United States going to be another empire like these other empires they knew from Europe, or was it going to be a true republic? And in fact, Indigenous Americans make these same claims, and I'm sure they do this strategically, but I think some of them also probably felt that they could actually make their way within the boundaries of the United States if they could convince enough Americans to live up to the values that they had expressed in the 1770s and 1780s. So I won't draw any more concrete parallels than that, but I think, you know, it's obvious that we're confronting similar situation today.
So there are a couple of questions that are maybe in some ways related. People asking about the curriculum that is in the Georgia State K through 12 education and wanting to know your thoughts about that. And also in institutions of higher learning, how does this history connect to Emory University and to the University of Georgia?
I can't speak from firsthand experience about the curriculum my kids are a little too young still, but I can't speak from firsthand knowledge about the curriculum that's in the high schools. I see the students who graduate from Georgia high schools in my classes at the University of Georgia, and it's certainly the case that everybody knows that the Cherokees were expelled and that Georgia played a role, but beyond that, I don't get the sense that there's any deeper knowledge of this moment and what it meant to Indigenous Americans and what it meant to the South and to the nation at large. So there's a sense that this was a tragic moment, but and in fact my students tell me this. they have a sense that it was a tragedy, but they don't know the full story of its connection to plantation slavery and to capital coming in from New York City, and they don't fully understand just how strongly Indigenous Americans resisted. Was there a second part to that question? Oh, University of Georgia. So, as I mentioned, I live right next to Lumpkin Street, and the university is built on Lumpkin's plantation. We certainly, faculty are aware of this. I don't know that it has been recognized in any official way, and it surely ought to be. It is true, thanks to the Institute of Native American Studies, of which I'm a part, we did secure in-state tuition for students who come from one of the nations whose traditional homelands were in Georgia. So if you're a Creek or a Cherokee citizen, for example, you get in-state tuition at the University of Georgia. But we should be doing far more. I think we should be offering scholarships to undergraduates and graduate students, and we don't. And that's just for starters. I don't know if Craig wants to add something about Emory.
Well, so Emory was founded, I mean, at least on paper, in 1836. And of course, this coincides with the same year that Creeks were removed from Alabama. But this is kind of a complicated story that you know more about than I do. Lower Creeks in Georgia, Creeks that were largely congregated along the Chattahoochee River, they had signed a treaty called the Treaty of Indian Springs, and they signed it in 1825, and they relinquished all their remaining lands in Georgia. But that treaty was considered to be so fraudulent that even Congress wouldn't ratify it. And basically both groups, Creek people and Congress, recognized that William McIntosh in particular, one of the Lower Creek leaders, and some other people just didn't have any authority that anyone recognized to sign away title to Creek lands. But then the next year, the government nonetheless managed to push through this Treaty of Washington in 1826. And it gets just more and more complicated because some Upper Creek headmen in Alabama did sign on to that treaty, but their motivation was that particular treaty guaranteed them to keep the remaining lands in Alabama under their jurisdiction into perpetuity. So that was their motivation for signing it, and Georgia lands they knew were gone. I mean, so they signed on to that treaty of 1826. So what I'm trying to say is that here where Emory is located, those lands had already been signed away, and Lower Creek people started to voluntarily immigrate to the territory a decade before the main body of the tribe did. So, you know, it's kind of an interesting situation because we have this glaring date that has so much resonance of 1836, where both of these things happened. Emory was founded, and then Creeks were removed. And yet, from this particular area where Emory sits, they had actually left beforehand. And the Lower Creeks had burned all bridges between themselves and the rest of the tribe, and they basically had to leave. Nobody wanted to put up with them anymore. So, yeah, that's the situation. And then at Emory, we're just now, I mean, just barely we've got started seeing some institutional support from one of our deans in particular about recruiting Native students. And so we're making some small inroads, and we were really excited about having this College Horizons program on campus this summer, which mentors Indian kids in terms of applying to colleges across the United States. And of course, the pandemic hit. So we still have that meeting virtually. We're going to have it in person for the first time next year. So in a way, well, in a lot of ways, we're way behind UGA in terms of some of the things that they've done. So we're just now getting started on addressing these issues.
Maybe one last question. There are several questions about the title of the book and the idea of an unworthy republic. Can you just talk about that a little?
It's a quote that comes from a letter that a man named James Pitchlynn, he was a student at Oxford University, a student in Ohio, at a small college in Ohio, and don't remember which one offhand, writing to his uncle, Peter Pitchlynn, about the situation that the Choctaws faced in the early 1830s. And it's just this wonderful quote when he says the United States is treating, he's talking, I guess, in this one instance about the Cherokees, but he says they're treating them as an unworthy republic would treat the Cherokees. So again, it touches on this theme I mentioned earlier, that there was a real sense in the 1830s that the United States might be different, that there were these values that Americans, white Americans and Black Americans had inherited, and that Native peoples were familiar with. And they used that language in their discussions and treaties. And so, I mean, that's really what the nation was confronted with in the 1830s. And I just think it kind of encapsulates that the story.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And Craig, thank you for being here to share your thoughts and comments. And thanks to all of you who joined us. We hope that you will join us again on October 12th for this remarkable panel that Craig has assembled. And again on November 8th for the live reading of Mary Catherine Nagel's play, Sovereignty. So warmest thanks to everyone and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.